Hello and welcome to our podcast. We are the Kaleidoscope team from the British Journal of Psychiatry, where every month we talk about some papers from our column in the BJ Psych. So last month we did a couple of papers and we got some feedback that it was long and boring. So we thought, screw you, we're doing 3 papers this month. When we ask for feedback, we mean good stuff, like were we funny, who is best dressed? Go start your own podcast. I am, of course, joking with that. Do give us any feedback you want, and please do add into the chat on the side. We're going to try and interact with you while we go through the papers. So we've got 3 of them this month. We're going to do big data and vaccines, really topical issues. We're going to talk about smoking and loneliness a little bit, and we're going to talk about expectancy and placebo. But the first one is big data and vaccines. So the paper is Bradley et al. Unrepresentative big surveys significantly overestimated US vaccine uptake in Nature. So this is kind of interesting to us for a few reasons. So the vaccines are really topical. People argue a little bit about the effectiveness. People argue quite a bit more about who should and shouldn't take it and should they be vaccinated. And what's interesting here is it interfaces that ever topical phrase of big data, which is what we're all supposed to be doing. And sometimes I think like machine learning and Bayesian, these are phrases that people introduce to pretend they're smart, but maybe they're not. But I'm going to pass this over to Dan at that point. I'm going to ask a couple of questions. You wrote this piece and you talked about the big data paradox and large sample asymptotics. So I wondered if you could start telling us what that is and how that links into this paper.
Yeah. So, like you say, Derek, the reason the paper is interesting is because it addresses a common fallacy that we see in applied sciences, where big is better, right? The more data points you've got, the better. And the big data paradox was an idea introduced by one of the authors on the Bradley paper, but introduced in a separate paper in 2018, which is this idea that big is not always better. And Meng, who came up with this idea in the original 2018 paper, then applied it in this paper with Bradley on the vaccine uptake data. If my understanding of Meng's paper is correct, and it might well not be, it's a complicated paper, but the idea is this, is that we're trained that you rely on a statistical estimate of something, for example, the average or the mean of some value. We're trained that the more samples you have, the more confidence or the less uncertainty you have in that estimate. And the example I think we used in the column was, if you know a coin, a fair coin, the probability of a heads or a tails should be 0.5, right? It should be equally likely you get a head or a tails. Now, if you take 1 or 2 samples, so you toss a coin 2 or 3 times, you might get 2 heads and 1 tail. So the probability of heads is 2/3 and the probability of tails is 1/3. So that's nothing like 50-50, 0.5 or half and half. Yeah. But what you say, the reason you're confident that you can use or rely on that argument is by the law of large numbers, which is an asymptotic argument, which is to say, if you were to flip that same coin 100 times, 1,000 times, or 1,000,000 times, yeah, when you get to 1,000,000, yeah, the actual estimate of the probability of heads or tails will converge to the theoretical or expected value, which is a half, right? So that argument, that sort of intuition, we carry over into big data. So we look for a precision around our estimate of the average value of something. Yeah, and we might measure that with the standard error. And we all know the formula for standard error. And the denominator of that formula is the square root of n, the number of samples. So by the same sort of large number reasoning, the more samples you have, the smaller that error will be, and the more confidence you have in the estimate of, say, the average vaccine uptake. So this was Meng's idea. And then Meng introduced a formula which breaks down the quality of a statistical estimator into 3 separate parts. One is the quantity or the scarcity of the data. The other part is the quality of the data, and the other part is the difficulty of the problem you're trying to address. Yeah, and the sum of those 3 things gives you an estimate of how good your data is. That all sounds very abstract until you look at Bradley's paper, right? So what they did is they applied this idea to some canonical big data sets. The first thing they did was they took a really well-designed survey, so proper population level survey methodology with appropriate sampling methods to make sure you don't underrepresent certain groups or overrepresent certain geographical areas, postcodes, SES, and so on. And that was the Ipsos survey. And they acquired 1,000 sample points per week, where they would inquire of the US population, have you taken up your vaccine? Yes, no. Yeah. The other surveys were opportunistic ones. So there's the Delphi Facebook survey, which collected 250,000 samples per week. Yeah. And then they looked at another one called the Census Household Pulse survey, which collected 75,000 responses every 2 weeks. So you've got really well-designed study, high quality, designed by survey methodologists, 1,000 data points per week. Opportunistic survey, Delphi Facebook, 250,000 every week. And then another one, the Census Household Pulse, where you have 75,000 every 2 weeks. And then they looked at that data and said, how well does it track the actual Center for Disease Control, the CDC's actual retrospective collection of data about vaccine uptake? Yeah. And what they found was the well-designed sample that only has the well-designed survey that only has 1,000 samples tracked the CDC retrospective estimate really robustly, really follows it closely. Both the Delphi Facebook and the Census Household Pulse, despite having really narrow standard errors, as you predict from exactly those asymptotic arguments, did not track the value at all. So, well, it did track it, that's not fair, but it got between 14 and 17% error. So it was out by quite a large number when you scale that to the population level. So Bradley's paper shows that really well-designed quality survey data with robust methodology captures the actual trend in the population. It estimates the trend in the population really well. Opportunistic, poorly designed surveys that do not use established survey methodology, okay, don't track it quite so well. In fact, they don't track it very well at all. Now, here's the reason that I got so excited about this paper. Not only is it really cool, but in addition to that, is from that formula I described to you, which is the sum of 3 separate components, you can do some sophisticated mathematics. And what you can arrive at is an estimate of the effective sample size, which is the sample size you would need to achieve parity with another method, for example. So they showed that the Delphi Facebook survey of 250,000 samples a week had the effective sample size of 10 samples from the well-designed survey. Yeah. So you've got 250,000 narrow standard errors, but it's an appalling estimator of the population trend of vaccine uptake. And you could have done better just by taking 10 well-designed random samples from the population. And that, for me, kills it. That for me was just the argument that made me think this is a beautiful piece of work. And it, I just thought that was genius. I'm going to say, I love that idea. The idea that big is not better, that the uncertainty estimates that we get from making coarse and theoretically unsound assumptions about large, the law of large numbers, asymptotic values, and our reliance on them is really conning us into believing that bigger is better. Here endeth the sermon.
Well, I'm going to pick up and, as the American in the room, say the thing that I think only I am best poised to say, which is that, yes, 100% confidence does not necessarily equal accuracy. And that's such an amazing example of that, right? But I love this for a lot of reasons. I love it because of its purity, right? I think that's really nice. It's super clear. It lets you know that sometimes it does feel, sort of David versus Goliath when it comes to research methods, and that, we as small PIs, people who are working in different kinds of academic settings, that we might not be able to compete against, Meta or whatever they call it now. And actually, thoughtfulness, almost like small batch, right? Like artisanal design wins the day here. And I think that's a great message for I don't know, for quality, for the importance of really understanding methodology, because I think a lot of times that's kind of the medicine you take with your sugar as you go through a lot of your studies, and recognizing the power of knowing it well when you know how to kind of, it's a sword you can use. I think that's great. I think that's a real validation of what we do in terms of education programs and what we can do in all different kinds of environments as researchers.
Of course, the consequence of this is people might misinterpret is, in that case, the rule is really small studies with only 8 participants in, absolutely brilliant, because that we can guarantee that's quality. The mistake would be to make an analogy or assume that small means well designed, because you can have a badly designed small study. And I know this because I've been involved in many of them.
Isn't this where we bring back the 21 left-handed man from last week?
I was just thinking the same thing.
I guess that there are a couple of take-home points for me. I think the first thing is you've kind of articulated that just having larger and larger sample sizes is not always going to reveal the true answer. And the second thing for me was that, in essence, if you think it through, there's an awareness of the kind of biases that were likely to influence the data. And they talk a little bit in the discussion around the impact of race, the impact of socioeconomic status. All will pull the data in different directions. So it's basically a sampling issue that the people that you're sampling are just not representative. If you had 250,000 and they were totally representative, you'd put the effort in to do that, then presumably, actually, you wouldn't get this big data paradox. Actually, both of the things would work in the same direction, but your error would reduce and your bias would be taken care of in your very careful design that Dawn spoke about. So it's not that big is bad. It's just that big and low quality has 2 differential effects. So it definitely increases the confidence because your error rates go down. But the problem is that any bias in the system looks like having more data also has an effect on conflating and kind of expanding that bias. It just makes it much bigger. And so they've done the kind of analyses where they've kind of corrected for race and economic status and shown you get a little bit closer to the truth, you just can't get rid of it. And the other thing that kind of occurred to me was that over the COVID period, there's been a massive expansion in studies which use online testing, which now gives you access to really large samples, which weren't possible if you were running a study in the university or the hospital. You tried to get subjects in and get them to do things, whereas now you can just pump it out on the engines that will find people. You can even put demographics, age, the kind of things, even race, that you might be interested in, and they'll get paid for doing the survey. But all of that data, and there must be hundreds of thousands of those publications now, will suffer from this big data paradox. And I think it's not something that's discussed in the discussion particularly. It's not something that's raised in those papers to say, actually, we've shown this, but actually you need to caveat that with the fact that we are likely to show highly significant effects which may or may not be replicated in smaller samples, but any bias that's present in a small fashion is also going to be massively expanded. So therefore, it behoves the people doing those kind of studies, if you're going to do it robustly, that you then either carry out a smaller study, which is effectively the equivalent of what you're seeing in that 1,000 people a week, which is stratified to try and minimize the biases. And it's almost like you need to use that approach for the online testing as a kind of internal check to say, we see these fantastic results, but actually in a small, really carefully selected sample, we also manage to observe the same things. Because if you start seeing biases in your very small sample, the chances are that those are going to be vastly inflated as your numbers go up. So I think just having the counterbalance of that any bias that goes into that system is massively expanded by having such large numbers was the thing that hadn't really occurred to me. I could only think of it in a simplistic way that more means the error's going down, so things are really significant. And in a way, used to that a little bit from epidemiological data, where you see, small effects are magnified in just by having very, very large data sets by the fact that the error goes down for those things. I don't know what you thought about that, Dan.
We talked about, do you remember, I think there was a column we wrote, I think probably about a year and a half, maybe 2 years ago now, where we looked at a paper that showed, again, challenged this idea that when you have a sort of marginal effect, and by marginal, it just looks like it might reach statistical significance. One of the arguments that we often make to persuade ourselves that the trend to significance is legitimate is the argument is, well, if we had a bigger sample size, the noise would be smaller, and therefore the effect would be much more contained around a narrower band of uncertainty around the estimate, like the mean or the average. And there was a really great paper we covered by Andrew Gelman and colleagues, which actually, using simulation, showed that noise amplifies as you scale up. It doesn't get smaller. So that argument's thrown out the window as well. And I think that's the thing that's why this paper really ignited my passion and interest, was because it's yet another example of where our intuitions that we all get from our training and from our experience doing research on different things are very often completely wrong. And that's kind of, and I know last month we talked about the problem with counterintuitive studies being wrong in themselves, but you'll have to just, well, that was last month. I'm not going to comment on that now.
So is that the answer to Angela's question about how we design a good study? In a sense, is it about having some humility with larger data sets and not just having the presumption that big is better?
I think the presumption big is better is the first thing to abandon. And then the second thing, and I think I put that in a reply to Angela, was that you need to ask a methodologist, right? You need a survey methodologist who spent their life and career studying and understanding the sources of bias and variance in different types of survey methodology.
Have they done that well enough if we have these problems now?
Well, that's the point. I think the Ipsos poll, the one that tracks CDC data, was designed, I assume, from the write-up in the Bradley paper. It seems that actually is a really well-designed study. One could infer they had methodologists on there who knew what they were doing. I'm not speaking ill of whatever Facebook and Delphi are called now, but the point being is just throwing a survey at there opportunistically and spreading it through social media contact may not, just because your standard errors are small doesn't mean that your estimate is meaningful, right? So your point estimate of the trend is completely off, even though your confidence in that point estimate is really, really narrow.
Can I jump in? Because I all of a sudden I'm thinking about the implications of this. And given the explosion of online data collection, like you mentioned, and actually, Suki, I think your idea about litmus testing against well-controlled small samples is totally the answer. But even if we got a handle on that now, right, even if we implemented that starting tomorrow across the board, we will have this kind of pipeline of really big biased studies coming out with massive confidence. And what I was thinking was those are going to be integrated into meta-analyses in the future. And those will so wildly throw off the ways in which the outcomes are interpreted. And those kinds of compiled papers tend to become like the reference resource on things. And I wonder if actually this bias isn't going to amplify even more as it becomes included into meta-analyses, and then as that becomes the kind of default reference. And what we might do to ward against that, or at least, sound the alarm.
Was that a question?
I mean, yes, no, I don't know. It just all of a sudden I went, oh man, because I can see, thinking back to being a student and you've got these really massive things and you're not quite sure, you don't quite have a handle on it. So a good review paper or a good meta-analysis is an amazing place to anchor your ideas and your thoughts. And if in fact we are baking this bias in and allowing them to skew because they're just so wildly outside of the ends of regular papers, it actually could shift trajectory quite a bit and will require a lot of that really purposeful correction with, well-crafted sample. Maybe it's not a big deal, but all of a sudden I just thought, oh man, it could be bad.
I think it speaks to the same point. I think one of the, in evidence-based medicine, one of the enthusiasms for meta-analysis is that you are borrowing strength from similar studies to narrow your confidence estimates or your uncertainty estimates and to arrive at a more precise point estimate for an effect size, a treatment or an intervention. And you read a lot of people when they don't like a meta-analysis, very often the criticism is, well, you've put incompatible crap in. It's no surprise that you get crap out. So I've read that a lot around, that seems to be the most common comeback when you have a meta-analysis that doesn't fit with your worldview, as you say, oh, well, of course, the stuff you put into your meta-analysis engine was rubbish, so it was going to produce meaningless crap anyway. So but it would be interesting to see, and I've no idea about this because I just don't have the intellectual sophistication, but it would be interesting to see whether or not the approach that Meng took of having this decomposition to define quality, whether or not you could apply it meaningfully to meta-analytic techniques. I wish I understood it enough to be able to do it, because that would be a really exciting idea. But again, I think, Dawn, you're right. It speaks to this idea of meta-analyses perhaps persuade us, or those of us who've got sort of an EBM background rather than being statisticians. It's kind of, well, it must be better because it's bigger and it combines and borrows strengths from multiple sources. But maybe that's too optimistic.
So I can leave the last word on this paper to Tomoka, who mentions about big data paradox and the election of Trump. So psephology and election science. So this is really interesting. It's going to be another debate for another time. It's been argued with Brexit too. So our next paper is Placebo and Expectation. So this paper is by Hjorth et al. In Translational Psychiatry. We'll put the link up, but the paper is called Expectancy Effects on Serotonin and Dopamine Transporters During SSRI Treatment of Social Anxiety Disorder, a randomized control trial. So I found this really interesting. So placebo is the bane of antidepressants in terms of interpreting literature. It's growing with time. There's the issue of nocebo, so you know what you're on. I thought this was quite a clever study in its design. So Dawn, do you want to tell us what they did?
It would be my great pleasure. So I got to tell you, I love a placebo paper. And I think it's because it is that place that sort of captures the magic of the interface between our minds and our bodies, right? And I think we love that. If you're interested in psychiatry and psychology, and I mean, that is an incredible space full of potential. And for whatever reason, I really liked this because the title makes it seem very niche, but I think it speaks to much broader concepts around psychiatric medications and what are we getting versus what are we creating. So they took a look at SSRIs, which we know are commonly used in anxiety and depression and are pretty well explored in the depression realm. And we're looking at it more in relation to anxiety. It's unclear beyond the sort of interaction with the serotonin transporter what mechanism is at play here. And I can remember in the 90s when SSRIs were super fresh and new and they seemed to hold all of this promise, right? And I remember a couple of things very specifically being communicated about that. Number one was the name. They are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, right? They were clean targets. And of course, we know that's not true. And then when that came to be the case, everyone imagined them as dirty drugs and whatever. But we never sort of got beyond that. You know, what is happening beyond interaction with the serotonin transporter? And the second was this idea that because it was a misunderstanding, a crude interpretation of previous work with antidepressants, but people thought they were happy pills, effectively, if you took them, they would instantly make you happy. And maybe that was just because you wanted them to be. So I kind of read this paper from that 1990s frame of, oh man, what do we know now? Where are we at? And what's really neat about this is we know for a fact that with SSRIs that effectiveness can certainly be ascribed to the placebo effect. We don't totally understand how that happens, but we do know that basically if you use an active placebo or something that causes a sensation that's similar to what a side effect would be if you were actually taking the drug, you end up with an increased expectancy of some kind of positive effect. And that definitely changes your trajectory for therapeutic outcomes. So there is power of the mind in this space. And what these guys did was kind of a follow-up on a previous study that they had done, but really slick, simple design. They effectively took a group of people with social anxiety disorder, and they either overtly gave them or covertly gave them escitalopram, an SSRI. Everybody got the same dose, and they were either told they were getting the drug for sure and that they should expect to see some sort of anti-anxiety benefit, or that they were being given a active placebo. But in fact, everybody was just getting the same drug at the same milligram for 9 weeks on. And what was amazing was they saw, significant anti-anxiety effects, a 4-fold increase of therapeutic efficacy in those that were told they were getting the medication over those that were not, even though they were getting the exact same thing. And so, they were curious about the mechanism behind that. And ultimately, of course, we know that serotonin transporter blockade is a key component. We know it's the kind of the main deal with how we think these drugs work. But again, it's roughly 80% in kind of the striatum. What else is going on? What is differentiating this fourfold effect between people who think they're taking the drug versus those who aren't? So what they did was they did some PET scans, and they just took a look at the binding around the serotonin and the dopamine transporters. And they reasoned this because there's been data to suggest that some of the SSRI side effects are actually dopamine based, and we know that there's sort of a reciprocal relationship between serotonin and dopamine in this space. And so they thought, yeah, let's give it a look. Let's see what's going on there. And what they actually found very clearly was that for those who were in the overt group, who knew they were taking the antidepressant drug, they had significantly better clinical outcomes, but they also had absolutely no correlation between what was happening with their serotonin transporter and those clinical outcomes. So everybody had the same kind of SERTs or serotonin transporter binding as everybody else, but you get this wildly different thing. But the difference comes when you look at binding to the dopamine transporter. And it turns out that is the mechanism of action that seems to correlate quite directly with the decrease in anxiety-like symptoms. And so for me, this, again, going back to this idea of how these drugs kind of first came to be, the idea that you would have this really prominent role for the dopamine transporter, and it's specifically around the psychological factor of expectation as being deeply meaningful in an anti-anxiety kind of effect, is very cool and really interesting. So I know you have plenty more to say about placebo, but I give you my sort of ode to the 1990s and where we might be now.
Who's going to take that up? Suki, Dan?
I think that so for me, I think there's no dispute that I think it's a really fascinating study, because I agree with Dawn. I kind of think, especially with pharmacology, when we're trying to apply that to mental health disorders, there's a real desire to simplify what the mechanism is. And that's, some people will partly say that that's because that's a sales pitch, essentially, that if you're going to sell a drug and you want to, you need to show that it's got a niche that it's occupying, it's kind of novel in some way, and that will encourage people both to prescribe it and to take it for a particular disorder. Too much complexity will spoil the message. So therefore, you're left with this story that serotonin-specific reuptake inhibitors kind of do exactly what it says on the tin, that they will inhibit the whatever the process is for reuptake of serotonin that's been released. So basically, if you can block them, you'll end up with higher levels of serotonin, and that is the reason why both depression and anxiety are reduced in those patients. Anybody who reads the literature in any detail will understand that the brain operates in very complex homeostatic fashion. So basically, no neurotransmitter, to our knowledge, certainly my knowledge, operates individually. That basically, if you change one thing, it will have a downstream effect on something else, and the brain will try and maintain balance through changing a different neurotransmitter. So in this case, clearly, there's a complex interaction between serotonin and dopamine, and we know that from lots of work in other disorders rather than anxiety, particularly things like psychosis, where we've looked at a lot of literature on drugs that are used to manage psychosis, and we know that various actions on dopamine also will have downstream impact on serotonin. So in a way, it's not surprising for us that something which has an impact on the serotonergic system will have a downstream impact on dopamine. And the thing that is surprising is just the beauty of the result, that it's really unusual to see something come out which is relatively clean. And so for me, you would like to see that replicated by another group, because this is essentially they've published one paper on a very similar theme, and this is a reanalysis of two arms of that data. And then they're quite open in saying in the discussion, actually, if you really wanted a pure factorial design, then you would actually have a placebo group which is told that you're taking the active drug, because that's the question this raises. Is it's fine to say, to give the drug and say you're not taking anything, this is a placebo, but it's actually something, so it's kind of sort of a negative kind of placebo effect, as opposed to giving something which is relatively benign and telling them. Because if the mechanism genuinely is this dopaminergic change, and that's measured by this DAT, then the test of that would be to say, hey, we're giving you the drug, good luck. And what you should see is rocketing or decreases in the DAT that you see here, with plus or minus these change and no change in the serotonin levels, because then you'd think this is a real thing that would actually then be kind of, you're really, and it's a bit, in a way, it's almost speaking to the question that we had before about design, and a question that if you attend to your design and your methodology, and the bias in this is you haven't got a non-medication system. So there's always going to be a level of interaction between the variables that you're looking at. So having that completed in your careful design would have really given this a lot more strength. But the fact that it's still, whatever, even if that other arm is missing, the fact that it's still showing you the effect of expectation plus or minus an interaction with drug is still quite an interesting finding, especially to see it in such a powerful way. So I guess it's telling us something that we knew already, that the power of placebo is significant. And it's adding one extra question, that is it something that is more related to dopamine? And we know, there's a bunch of literature on dopamine, that it is, core to kind of reward learning and hedonic response, but also that it's dynamic in the sense that dopamine signal changes with experience, that it might, with novel things, it might spike earlier or later. And then once you start chaining activity, the actual kind of consumption phase of these rewarded learning tasks may signal earlier. So we know that it's a plastic signal. So it's no surprise that you can see changes in these. And the regions that they describe are the kind of classic regions that are involved in that reward processing network. So that raises an interesting question about how much expectation and anticipation, which we know are core to reward learning, is a feature of the placebo response. And then the final bit of that is that, can we use that in a very positive way? And in the past, we've talked about the importance of hope in terms of engendering positive outcomes, which is very, when you say it like that, it seems very unscientific to say, well, what role has hope got? And often we had a discussion with our medical students about the fact that they're encouraged not to be very excessively positive about outcomes of the patients that they see. They're advised to go back to the data. If somebody says, am I going to get better, doctor? It's not good to say, yeah, I think, you'll be fine. That's considered bad medicine. Whereas saying, the data suggests there's about an 80% chance that things will turn out well, and 20% of this, and you're likely to fall into the 80% because you're younger, you've got higher symptoms at baseline. That's the way you should approach. But actually, this kind of paper suggests that actually, under certain restrictions, that kind of positive message may be something which will actually enhance your treatment response, especially if it's coming from someone who's telling you that this is something that's likely to be helpful. So it raises some very interesting questions for the communication with people who might be taking these drugs.
I wondered what your thoughts were on this. As you were talking, Suki, you sort of nailed all of the things that I was thinking of and that I was going to use to make myself sound like I'd read the paper in detail. So thanks for that. Anyway, it just occurred to me, is this really a study of placebo? Isn't it really a study of what happens when you reduce expectations for an active biological compound? Because I thought, and I haven't looked the definition up recently enough, but placebo has to be biologically inert. So this isn't biological inert, right? This is both parties are being given the same drug, but one party is having its expectation of a positive outcome deliberately reduced. So is it really looking at placebo? By the way, I think it's a super exciting paper, but is it really speaking to the placebo thing at all? Wouldn't we need that factorial contrast so that we could say, I have actually given you nothing, yeah, but told you it's something, yeah, and I can then contrast your DAP binding in the striatum, which is basically where they found the changes. I can then have a true contrast for the 2x2 factorial design that I'm interested in, which is people on the drug not expecting it to work, people not on the drug but expecting it to work, right? So the genuine placebo with expectation. So that would be super cool. And my worry with this paper, not that it's my job to police it, but I do worry a little bit that this might be one of those papers that gets misrepresented as, well, we told you it was all placebo anyway. And if you read the paper carefully, that's not what it says at all. It actually says there's a modulating effect of some sort of cognitive, the delivery of some sort of cognition, yeah, actually changes the way dopamine, or at least I think it was in a dopamine transporter binding. I might have misremembered that as well, but it tells you that there's a physiological effect there. Yeah. But it doesn't tell you that there's no need for the medication, because of course you don't have the counterfactual here, whereas what if you told them that but didn't give them anything biologically active? So it's a super cool paper. I just worry that it will be misinterpreted as, we told you all along they're just placebos, which I think would be an unfortunate misrepresentation. In fact, a weaponization of this piece of work.
I think there's actually two things. I think that I suspect, and I don't know, I suspect the reviewers have picked that up, because there's a reason why the title says expectancy effects. So they don't mention, the only place that the placebo is mentioned in the abstract is the literature suggests. They're not using placebo at all. They talk about this expectancy effect. So they're very clear in what they are representing.
That was my fault for not reading it carefully enough, which is exactly what I was just cautioning against. Sorry.
Well, I was going to ask, does it have an actual name? If it's not placebo, and if it doesn't, could we call it jose-placebo? If you're the first person to have identified this, but I think expectancy effect is probably what it's known.
That's quite a pendulous expression.
Jose-placebo. I'm going to go with that. So we're going to very briefly do the final paper, just for a couple of minutes, because it was an interesting finding on smoking, and we said we'd talk about it. So this is about smoking and loneliness. Philip et al. In Lancet Regional Health Europe, and the paper is titled Relationship of Smoking with Current and Future Social Isolation and Loneliness, a 12-year follow-up study. So it was kind of interesting for a couple of reasons. We'll just go through some major headlines on it. So when we were growing up, smoking was associated with being cool and having lots of friends. I'm old enough that in my school when I was younger, there was a smoking room for the older children. Yeah, I know how. You have to be 16 or 17, but a smoking room for children. And it's probably some of the advertising of it as well. But this study asked if it's true. So it's a longitudinal cohort study. It's part of a long study called the LSAT that follows up. It's an English study following people up over long periods of time. So here they've 9,000 people followed up over 12 years. And just a couple of headline findings, and I'll throw it out for a brief discussion. So at baseline, smokers were lonelier, had fewer social engagements, and fewer engagements with cultural and community events. But they were able to follow that up over 12 years, and that effect increased with time. So smokers became ever lonelier, ever more isolated. So I'm curious why that's the case. And it was independent of lots of variables, including age, sex, social class, physical illness, and so forth. So what's a take-home message to people? Does smoking cause loneliness? No, vaping doesn't cause loneliness either.
No, it certainly doesn't. My reading of this paper, I read it quite quickly, but the thing that I couldn't quite make sense of was, at least in the abstract, it's introduced as there's this kind of conception that smoking is pro-social. It's a sociable activity and that's one of its benefits. And then they use the data to say, clearly not. So if that was the intention of the paper, I guess it succeeded. But to establish, I mean, I don't think there's any attempt in the paper to establish causality. So it's an association finding, right? It's that when you follow these people up, not only were they lonelier at baseline, they were lonelier more so 12 years on. I don't know that they went for they didn't, as far as I understood it, introduce a causal model for this to say, well, then smoking. It's just that it sort of speaks against this commonly held belief that smoking is social.
I think they make the point that there are, if you look at the literature between it, they're using a kind of reverse of that argument that actually folk who are lonely are more likely to smoke. So again, I'm not sure that's the causal argument. They're saying there's very little data doing what they've done, which is kind of looked to see what happens kind of effectively, prospectively. So I think you're right. I guess if you wanted to look for a message from it, it's that, stop smoking. But you can't say stopping smoking is going to make you more popular or less lonely. So I think the message you can take from it is somewhat limited. You could argue that it's another example of a kind of counterfactual that maybe, we're so used to people hanging outside, especially now as you're driving past, you see people smoking outside, and usually it's one or two people or a group of people who look like they're smoking. And I guess there's nothing still to say that people who are smoking may be more sociable and less lonely, because this takes a sample which is relatively old. I think most of them are over 65. So I guess it may also be difficult to generalize that to a younger sample or population.
And John's comment there, I mean, going forward in the world where it's ever harder to smoke, it mentions about environments such as restaurants and so forth. So it's certainly from having smoking rooms for children in schools, it's now the case that you really can't smoke. And smoking in airplanes, you remember that?
Oh, yeah.
Only one part of it, right? So you could sit behind the smokers. So it's also that there is a social effect going forward. It's an exclusionary habit, I guess. Yeah, and we've got to hear, so Galea also talks about smoking is normal to smoking is stigmatized. Aren't they smoking outside precisely because it's so anti? So this is a hardcore audience today. No smokers here.
It is. Yeah, I think the premise, at least in the abstract of the paper, was that, there's this belief that smoking is social. Well, I'm not actually sure I would support that argument, but as a former smoker who benefited many times from spontaneous ad hoc interactions with strangers in the street outside of pubs when you had to go outside for a cigarette, I actually have to say that the first thing that anyone would say to you is, it's like, smoking outside, yeah, great. And it's just like, smokers are the friendly ones. Look, we're here chatting. We would never have talked to a pub full of 400 people. We would never have met had we not stood outside smoking. So I think confusing that, which is opportunism, with a population level effect about, the smoking good for you or bad for you, does it make you lonely or does it make you happy, I think is probably stretching it a little bit. But it was always nice to meet like-minded, social pariahs who similarly wanted to inhale fumes and carbon monoxide outside a pub. Looking back, it seems like madness, doesn't it? But I remember enjoying it at the time.
Only Adrian's being prompted here to have a cigarette. Everyone else is being quite difficult against it. But I mean, but I think the comments in the chat are, they're identifying lots of confounders with it. But again, that exclusion factor. So I think we weren't going to go into this in depth. We thought it might be a fun one to end with. So thank you for joining us. We hope you enjoyed it, despite having 3, and we hope to see as many of you as possible next month. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.